Today, we are diving deep into one of the greatest, most fascinating archaeological controversies of all time. Seriously, it's a story that has everything: a priceless manuscript, a public shaming, a tragic death, and a discovery 60 years later that changes the entire story. This is the incredible case of the Shapira Scroll. And let's start with a quote from the man right at the center of it all, Wilhelm Shapira. He wrote this back in 1883, and, he had no idea just how prophetic those words would become. He was about to become the ultimate victim of that very tendency. So here's how we're going to break this all down. We'll kick things off with the sensational discovery itself, then walk through the damning accusation and its tragic consequences. After that, we're going to jump forward in time to a discovery that changed the whole game, re-examine the original case, and then end with the hunt for this lost scroll today. All right, so let's set the scene. The year is 1883. A well-known and sometimes controversial antiques dealer from Jerusalem named Wilhelm Shapira arrives in London, and he's carrying a collection of leather fragments that he believes will shake the very foundations of the biblical world. What he had were 15 brittle, blackened pieces of leather, and on them was a version of the biblical book of Deuteronomy. But here's the kicker. It was different from the accepted text. It even had a slightly different version of the Ten Commandments, and this is why it was so absolutely explosive. If it was authentic, it would be a version of the Bible from before it was the Bible we know, predating the standard text by centuries. It would challenge the entire history of the Holy Book. Shapira knew exactly what he had, or at least what he thought he had. He walked into the British Museum and offered it to them for £1 million. £1 million! That was an absolutely astronomical sum back then. We're talking well over £100 million in today's money. The stakes could not have been higher. Now, the museum was definitely intrigued, but the academic world, they were deeply skeptical. An ancient manuscript of this age was thought to be impossible. So to deliver a final verdict, they brought in two of the biggest names in the field: the French scholar Charles Clermont-Ganneau and the museum's very own expert, Christian David Ginsburg. So the case against Shapira was built on 4 key arguments. First, the experts claimed the leather strips weren't ancient at all. They were just cut from the blank bottom margins of existing, much newer Torah scrolls. Second, they pointed to these vertical lines on the leather that the ancient scribes seemed to have just totally ignored, writing right over them. A really sloppy mistake, right? Third, they dismissed the writing itself as just a clumsy copy of another famous artifact, the Moabite stone. And finally, and this seemed to be the nail in the coffin, was the climate. Everybody knew that leather simply couldn't survive for thousands of years in that region. It was considered an impossibility. The verdict was swift, it was public, and it was absolutely brutal. For Shapira, this wasn't just some academic disagreement. No, this was the complete and utter destruction of his reputation, his career, and his life. Just look at how quickly this all happened. On August 21st, Clermont-Ganneau publishes his verdict in the newspaper for the whole world to see. The very next day, Ginsburg makes it official. Shapira became a public laughingstock literally overnight. And less than 7 months later, completely ruined, he took his own life. And just like that, the case was closed. The scroll, now considered a worthless fake, was sold off and forgotten. Or so everyone thought. For more than 60 years, that's where the story ended. A sad, cautionary tale about an overambitious forger. But then, in the 1940s, something happened that no one in the 19th century could have ever predicted. Yep, in 1947, shepherds stumbled upon a treasure trove of ancient texts hidden in caves near the Dead Sea. And get this, it was the very same region where Shapira claimed his scroll was found. The Dead Sea Scrolls were a revolutionary discovery. For the first time, we had real examples of what authentic 2,000-year-old biblical manuscripts actually looked like. And suddenly, the cold case of the Shapira Scroll was wide open again. Okay, so now we have the Dead Sea Scrolls as our new benchmark, and with them, we can go back and reevaluate those arguments that totally condemned Shapira. Let's see how those 1883 accusations hold up against what we know now. All right, let's start with that big, fundamental objection, that ancient leather just couldn't survive. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls proved that was completely wrong. Thousands of leather fragments, some over 2,000 years old, were found perfectly preserved in the dry microclimate of the Dead Sea caves. What was considered totally impossible in 1883 turned out to be a simple fact. And check this out. This is where a detail that seemed really suspicious back then now looks like a major sign of authenticity. Shapira said his fragments were found wrapped in linen and coated in this dark, waxy substance to preserve them. At the time, that sounded like a totally made-up, fanciful detail. But decades later, guess how many of the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, preserved in exactly the same way. Okay, you might be thinking, but what about that sloppy scribe? This was probably the most damning piece of physical evidence. The idea that the writer had carelessly ignored the vertical lines that marked the columns. It seemed like an open and shut case of a forger messing up. But was it really? The crucial mistake the 19th century experts made is actually hidden in plain sight, in Ginsberg's own drawings from 1883. You see, his drawings show that there weren't one, but two sets of vertical lines. There were deep creases, fold lines, from where the scroll had been rolled up for centuries. And then there were these faint, scratched-in rule lines that the scribe used to mark the edges of the text. The text does cross over the deep fold lines, of course, but it perfectly respects the faint rule lines. The experts confused the deep creases for the scribe's guidelines. The scribe wasn't sloppy at all, he was incredibly precise. So the case for forgery is, well, it's collapsing pretty fast. And if the scroll was likely authentic, that leads us to the biggest question of all. Where is it now? For decades, the accepted story was that the scroll fragments were sold to a collector and then destroyed in a house fire in 1899. A tidy end to the story. But recent research has proven this is a myth. The scroll wasn't destroyed. It was just lost. Here's what we now know. The scroll was sold around 1888 to a Dr. Philip Brooks Mason, who was a prolific collector of, well, everything. He even exhibited the fragments at a meeting in 1889. But after he died in 1903, his enormous collection was auctioned off. And somewhere in that massive, largely unrecorded sale, the Shapira Scroll just vanished from history. So when you look at it, every single argument used to condemn the Shapira Scroll has been overturned by modern archaeology. What was dismissed as a clumsy fake now looks like it could have been a genuine Dead Sea Scroll, just discovered 60 years too early. And if that's true, it leaves us with one incredible, tantalizing question. Could the world's oldest biblical manuscript still be out there somewhere, sitting forgotten in an attic or a dusty archive, just waiting to be rediscovered?